Silence has a texture here. Not the silence of an empty room, but something thicker, something that presses against your ears the moment you step outside and the door seals shut behind you. Your breath leaves your body and turns solid before it even finishes leaving your lips. Your eyelashes stiffen. The air itself seems to thin and sharpen, like breathing through glass. In the deepest cold, if you listen closely, the moisture in your own breath crystallizes with a faint, dry whisper, a sound locals sometimes call the whisper of stars. Somewhere beneath your boots, the ground has been frozen since before the first pyramids were built, and it will likely still be frozen long after you are gone. This is Siberia in winter, and for millions of people, this is simply Tuesday. A window frame here can grow its own miniature forest of frost overnight, delicate branching patterns spreading across the glass while everyone inside sleeps. Step out at just the right temperature and you might hear a low, almost musical crackling in the air itself. Tiny ice crystals brushing past your ears as they form and fall. It sounds, if you let yourself imagine it, like the sky quietly exhaling. We tend to imagine the coldest places on Earth as empty ones, blank white maps with no names on them. But scattered across this frozen expanse are cities with opera houses, villages with wood-fired saunas, children walking to school in temperatures that would be front-page news anywhere else in the world. People do not merely survive here. Many of them will tell you without a trace of irony that they love it, that they could not imagine living anywhere warmer, anywhere softer, anywhere less honest about what it takes to be alive. So what does it actually feel like to build a life at the edge of what a human body can endure? Not the postcard version, not the record-breaking headline, but the version with grocery bills and school runs and grandmothers making soup. That is the story we are about to tell. Before we go further, if you enjoy traveling to places most people will only ever see in a video like this one, consider subscribing because we're going to keep opening doors like this one all year. And I am curious, wherever you are watching from right now, however far from -50 that might be, tell us in the comments. Let's find out just how far apart we all are. To understand Siberia, you first have to let go of the idea that it is a country, or even a single place. It is a region, a vast northern third of Asia that begins at the Ural Mountains and does not stop until it reaches the Pacific Ocean, thousands of kilometers later. Depending on how generously you draw its borders, Siberia covers somewhere around 13 million square kilometers. That is larger than Canada, the second biggest country on the planet, and Siberia is not even a country. It is simply a piece of one, a piece so enormous that when the sun is setting over its eastern edge on the Pacific coast, it is still deep in the night far to the west, near the Urals. Roughly 36 million people are scattered across all of that space, which means the average square kilometer of Siberia holds barely a handful of residents. A density so low it is almost easier to describe in terms of what is missing than what is there. Within this immensity, geography changes dramatically depending on where you stand. In the west lies the West Siberian Plain, one of the flattest, largest lowlands on Earth, a marshy expanse of rivers and wetlands stretching across more than 2.5 million square kilometers on its own. Toward the center and east, the land begins to lift into plateaus and mountain ranges, including the East Siberian Highlands, where peaks approach 3,000 meters and largely uninhabited terrain swallows entire provinces whole. Forests of larch cover much of the middle latitudes. Trees that, unusually for conifers, shed their needles every autumn like something almost tropical. A strange soft detail in an otherwise unforgiving landscape. Nearly all of it sits atop permafrost, ground that has remained frozen, in some places, for tens of thousands of years, underlying roughly 2/3 of Russian territory in total. Novosibirsk, in the west, has grown into the region's largest city, an industrial and academic hub that feels, in many ways, like a different country entirely from the remote settlements further east and north. At the far eastern edge of this world lies the Sakha Republic, also known as Yakutia, the largest federal subject in Russia by area, a territory so vast that its permafrost zone alone has been compared to a landmass several times the size of France. Its capital is Yakutsk, a city built directly on that ancient permafrost, founded in the 1630s by Cossacks pushing the Russian Empire eastward, and later transformed by the discovery of gold and diamonds in the surrounding region. Today, it is widely recognized as the coldest city of its size anywhere on Earth. Winters here regularly plunge past -40, and the lowest temperature ever recorded in the city sits somewhere around -64 degrees Celsius. Not far away, past a landscape empty enough to swallow the idea of a road entirely, sits the small settlement of Umayakon, whose name, fittingly, is believed to come from a local word for water that does not freeze, a nod to nearby thermal springs. Oymyakon competes for the title of the coldest permanently inhabited spot on the entire planet, with historical readings dropping below -67 degrees Celsius. To put that in perspective, at that temperature, exposed skin can begin to freeze within minutes, and a cup of boiling water thrown into the air will turn to mist before it ever reaches the ground. Each year, as the brutal season finally loosens its grip, the region hosts what is sometimes called the Cold Pole Festival, complete with reindeer races and dog sledding. A community's way of marking that it has, once again, made it through. And yet, travel far enough southwest, and Siberia softens into something entirely different. Along the border of Buryatia sits Lake Baikal, the oldest and deepest lake on the planet, formed roughly 25 million years ago in a slow tectonic rift that continues to widen even now. It holds close to a fifth of all the unfrozen fresh water on Earth, more than all of North America's Great Lakes combined. And its waters are so clear that in places you can see tens of meters down into a blue that looks almost lit from within. Around its southern curve runs the Trans-Siberian Railway, a feat of 19th century engineering completed at the turn of the 20th century. Its route around the lake alone requiring roughly 200 bridges and 33 tunnels to connect this remote corner of the world to Moscow, thousands of kilometers away. Further north still, the taiga forest eventually gives way to open tundra, where trees thin out and finally disappear altogether, replaced by low shrubs and moss that cling to a landscape scoured by wind for most of the year. The mountain ranges threading through the republic's east, including the Verkhoyansk Range, once carried glaciers of their own, though the climate here has long been too dry. Ironically, for much snowfall to accumulate at higher elevations, leaving deep, silent valleys carved instead by rivers grinding slowly through frozen rock. It is a landscape that rewards patience and punishes carelessness in equal measure, and it has done so for longer than written history can account for. Light itself behaves strangely out here. In the depths of winter, some parts of the north see only a few hours of pale daylight, the sun barely clearing the horizon before slipping away again. By midsummer, that debt is repaid with interest, and the sky can stay bright for nearly the entire 24 hours, turning the short warm season into something almost frantic with life. As if the land knows exactly how little time it has been given. If the land itself is defined by extremes, daily life here is defined by adaptation, by 1,000 small engineering decisions most of us never have to think about. Take the buildings. In Yakutsk, nearly every apartment block, hospital, and school stands raised above the ground on concrete piles, sometimes driven 10 meters deep into the permafrost. It is not an architectural style choice. It is survival. A heated building resting directly on frozen ground would slowly melt the earth beneath it, and the entire structure would begin to sink and crack, exactly the way frozen ice cream softens against a warm plate. So the buildings float above the soil instead, with a gap of open air underneath, letting the cold circulate and keeping the permafrost exactly as frozen as it needs to stay. Some newer structures go a step further, relying on sealed tubes called thermosiphons, technology that actively draws heat out of the surrounding soil during the coldest months to keep the ground beneath key buildings locked below freezing year-round. Walk through the city and you will notice something else missing from the ground: pipes. Water, sewage, and heating lines cannot be buried here either, for the same reason, so they run overhead instead, wrapped and insulated, forming an odd looping skyline of metal tubing that snakes between buildings like the exposed plumbing of the whole city. There are no underground parking garages in Yakutsk either. Ground floors of apartment blocks are built to double as covered parking, since digging beneath the surface simply isn't an option. Cars present their own puzzle. In the coldest months, an engine switched off can freeze solid within hours, its fluids turning thick and sluggish. So many residents leave their vehicles running for extended stretches, sometimes for an entire workday, parked and idling outside offices and apartment blocks, doors left unlocked, keys left inside. Because as more than one local has pointed out, nobody is stealing a car at -50. Others install block heaters that plug into outdoor sockets, a common enough sight that entire parking lots are wired for it. Rows of extension cords running out to warm the engines of vehicles that would otherwise refuse to start by morning. Many people simply let their cars sit frozen and unused from autumn until spring, relying instead on public buses and heated shelters at the stops, some equipped with phone chargers and screens showing arrival times, small comforts engineered for a population that has learned exactly how much comfort the cold will allow. Clothing follows its own quiet logic, built up over generations by the indigenous Saka people long before modern synthetic fabrics ever arrived. Traditional winter dress covers the body almost completely, leaving only the eyes exposed, built in careful layers designed to trap warmth rather than block cold, since even a small gap of exposed skin can lose heat rapidly enough to become dangerous. An underlayer, traditionally cut from soft rawhide, sits closest to the skin, followed by insulating layers and a heavy fur-lined outer coat, with boots called untamed, made from reindeer hide and lined with felt, protecting the feet from ground that never truly thaws. These are not fashion statements so much as inherited technology, refined over centuries by people who had no choice but to get it right, and versions of it are still worn today, particularly at festivals and in the depths of the coldest months. Then there is food, which in this part of the world is shaped as much by geography as by taste. Fresh produce is scarce and expensive, since almost everything green has to travel enormous distances to arrive here at all. In its place, the local diet leans on what the land and rivers actually provide. Fish caught in autumn or through holes cut in frozen rivers is frozen almost immediately and kept that way through winter, only to be sliced into long, thin, curling ribbons and eaten raw with salt and pepper. A dish known as stroganina, something like a distant frost-covered cousin of sashimi. It is taken seriously enough that Yakutsk holds its own Stroganina festival, where carvers compete to shave the thinnest, most elegant curls from a frozen fish, some skilled enough to fashion the slices into rosettes. Horse meat and dairy also play an outsized role, since Yakutian horses have been bred here for centuries specifically because they can survive winters that would kill most other livestock. A dish called khan, a type of blood sausage, and another called indigirka, cubes of frozen fish mixed with onion and pepper, sit alongside fermented mare's milk and a thick, tangy yogurt called sworat. Rounding out a cuisine built entirely around one central practical question: what actually keeps a person alive and properly nourished through 8 months of relentless cold, in a place where anything green and imported tends to carry a price tag far removed from what the land and rivers provide for free? Underneath all of this practical adaptation lies something less visible but arguably more important: a way of understanding the world that has been shaped, quite literally, by the rhythm of light and dark. The Saka people, the largest indigenous group in the region, trace their roots to Turkic peoples who migrated north many centuries ago and built an entire civilization around herding, fishing, and an intimate, almost spiritual relationship with the land's seasons. Traditionally, nature here was never seen as empty or inert. Rivers, forests, and animals were understood to carry their own spirits. Deities the Saka called the Ai, benevolent forces tied to the sun and to life itself, honored through ritual and gratitude rather than fear. That worldview survives today not only in ceremony but in story. The Saka carry a rich oral tradition of epic poems known as olonko, vast narrated tales of heroes, gods, and ancestral struggle, once performed over hours by trained storytellers, and still passed down as a living link to a version of the world that predates any Russian influence at all. That worldview reaches its fullest expression once a year, in a festival called Yiyak, sometimes spelled Isyak, held around the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. The word itself is often translated as abundance, and abundance is exactly the point. After 8 or 9 months of brutal cold and short, grudging daylight, the arrival of true summer is treated not as a minor seasonal shift, but as an entire new year, a second beginning layered on top of the one the rest of Russia celebrates in January. According to Saka legend, the very first yak was held by a figure named Ele Butur, a founding ancestor of the people, and the largest modern celebration still takes place on the meadow where that first gathering is said to have occurred, just outside Yakutsk, drawing crowds that can swell into the hundreds of thousands. At the center of the grounds stands a circular altar called a tayusyolje, ringed by young birch trees, holding a ceremonial vessel called a karoon filled with fermented mare's milk. An elder, dressed in white, opens the ceremony by sprinkling that kumis onto the earth and into the fire, offering thanks to the Ai spirits and asking for the well-being of everyone gathered. Nearby stands a carved wooden post called a surge, a hitching post meant, according to belief, for the horses of the gods, who are said to descend from the sky on the day of the solstice. From there, the celebration turns to a slow, spiraling circle dance called the Ohu Kai, thousands of linked hands moving together in rhythm, a kind of moving prayer meant to greet and honor the sun, along with wrestling, horse racing, and feasting that stretches through the short, bright night. It is, in a very real sense, the emotional opposite of everything winter demands. Instead of endurance, celebration; instead of scarcity, abundance; instead of silence, sound. That instinct toward gathering and mutual support runs deeper than a single festival. Researchers studying remote Saka communities have documented long-standing networks of sharing, food, tools, information, even rides between distant settlements, that function as a kind of informal social safety net. one that becomes especially important during extreme weather or hardship, when formal support from distant authorities can be slow to arrive. It is a practical philosophy as much as a cultural one. In a place this remote, you help your neighbor today because you may very well need your neighbor tomorrow. If you are starting to notice that this entire culture seems to orbit around waiting, around the long, patient anticipation of light, you are exactly right, and that pattern holds throughout much of Siberia's indigenous world. The Evenks and Evens, spread thinly across the taiga further north and east, built their own traditions around reindeer herding and seasonal migration, moving with their animals across enormous, largely roadless territory. Further south and west, the Buryats settled around Lake Baikal, developing a distinct culture that blends elements of Tibetan Buddhism with older shamanic practice. Their temples and prayer flags standing in quiet contrast to the animist rituals of the Sakha further east. Each of these peoples arrived at a different answer to the same underlying question the land itself keeps asking over and over, every single year. How do you build a life around a season that insists on taking almost everything back before giving anything in return? Before we go further into what daily life here actually costs, both financially and emotionally, it is worth pausing to subscribe if this kind of deep, unhurried travel is what you come here for. Because there are many more corners of this planet we still intend to open up together. None of this, though, should be mistaken for an easy life, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. Siberia's economy, particularly in places like Yakutia, rests heavily on what lies beneath the frozen ground rather than on what grows above it. Diamonds are the region's most famous export, mined by a company that ranks as the world's largest diamond producer by volume. Responsible for the vast majority of Russia's diamond output and roughly a quarter of global extraction. Headquartered in the mining town of Mirny, there, an enormous open pit, largely worked underground now that surface reserves have been exhausted, has shaped the entire local economy for decades, anchoring thousands of jobs directly and many more indirectly across the Republic, and generally paying wages noticeably higher than the regional average. Gold, tin, oil, and natural gas round out a resource-driven system that has built entire towns around a single employer, the kind of place locals call a monogorod, a mono-city, dependent almost entirely on one industry's fortunes, and increasingly aware that many of these mineral deposits will not last forever. That dependency creates real and uneven consequences. Wages tied directly to mining or major state resource companies tend to be relatively strong, but many other jobs, particularly in the public sector, pay considerably less, and residents in some of these towns have described stretching a modest state salary against prices that do not discriminate between incomes, because so much has to be transported across such extraordinary distances. Often along roads that are only reliably passable once frozen solid enough to drive across, fresh food and imported goods can carry prices that feel entirely disconnected from local wages. Heating, by contrast, tends to be relatively affordable, subsidized in a region that quite literally cannot survive without reliable warmth. But that single mercy does not offset the broader arithmetic of daily life in one of the most remote inhabited places on the planet. Beyond the resource sector itself, much of the visible economy in towns like Yakutsk revolves around supporting that industry indirectly, from food processing and construction to sawmills and the region's own permafrost research institutions, which have become an unlikely export of expertise in their own right, consulted by engineers building on frozen ground elsewhere in the Arctic. Tourism remains a relatively small piece of the picture, limited by both the extreme climate and the sheer difficulty of simply arriving. though a steady trickle of travelers now makes the journey specifically to experience conditions unlike anywhere else on Earth, a curiosity the local economy has only recently begun to lean into. Isolation itself is a cost that rarely shows up on a receipt. Large stretches of Yakutia remain cut off from any permanent road network for months at a time, with the mighty Lena River itself severing the region for roughly half the year, reachable only once its surface freezes thick enough to become a temporary winter highway, or by air, where flights can be delayed for days by weather that grounds everything without warning. A bridge across the Lena, long discussed, has only in recent years moved toward actual construction, a reminder of just how young the region's permanent infrastructure still is. Healthcare, specialized services, even something as simple as a reliable internet connection can be harder to access the further you travel from Yakutsk itself. It is little wonder that younger generations increasingly drift toward that capital, or further still toward Moscow, drawn by opportunities that simply do not exist in smaller villages, leaving behind aging populations and communities that must work harder each year to hold on to their traditions. And then there is the newest, strangest threat of all: warmth. The very permafrost that Siberian engineers have spent decades learning to build around is now thawing in places, as the Arctic warms at a pace faster than almost anywhere else on the planet. In Yakutsk, residents have watched Soviet-era apartment blocks begin to tilt and crack as the frozen ground beneath their piles softens for the first time in living memory, with at least one documented building shifting by tens of centimeters over just a couple of years, forcing emergency structural repairs in the depths of winter. Roads buckle unpredictably. Sidewalks rise and cave, and scientists at the region's dedicated Permafrost Institute now spend as much time studying decay as they once spent studying stability. It is a strange, almost poetic irony. A place defined for centuries by the reliability of its cold is now having to reckon with what happens when that cold can no longer be entirely trusted. So, could you actually live here? Not visit, not admire from a warm hotel window, but actually live here, year after year, through 8 months where the sun barely clears the rooftops and every single errand requires calculation. Most of us, honestly, probably could not, at least not without a long and humbling adjustment. And that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something about how narrow our definition of a livable life often is, shaped entirely by the mild, temperate places most of us happen to have been born into. But the people who do live here, who have always lived here, are not simply enduring some grim punishment. They have built entire systems of meaning around exactly the conditions the rest of the world tends to see only as an obstacle. Homes engineered with genuine ingenuity, floating above ground that must never be allowed to feel their warmth. A cuisine that turns scarcity into something with real flavor, texture, and centuries of refinement behind it. Networks of quiet, practical generosity that keep entire communities standing through the hardest months. And a festival, older than most nations currently on a map, that treats the return of daylight not as a minor relief, but as the beginning of everything. A yearly reminder that abundance always follows patience, that the light always eventually comes back, even after the longest, darkest stretch you can imagine. Maybe that is the real lesson tucked inside a place like Siberia, one that has nothing to do with temperature at all. Most of us will never stand in air cold enough to freeze our breath before it leaves our mouths, or watch a splash of water disappear into mist before it lands. But we all know what it is to wait through our own kind of winter, whatever form that takes, and to wonder if the light is really going to come back this time. In Yakutia, they built an entire festival, an entire philosophy, around the certainty that it will. and they have been proving it right for as long as anyone can remember. If a place like this pulled you in, even for these few minutes, consider subscribing and joining us for wherever we travel next. Because the world still has far more of these hidden extraordinary corners left for us to explore together. And I would genuinely love to have you along for the next one.